Here's the deal. I love decks and I love accent features, but most of the decks that I was seeing that have some type of pattern or just are really fun are more with the deck boards and not so much with an accent piece. I saw a lot of decks like this and this and this, and I love them. I think they're beautiful. But when I came across this deck on Pinterest, I knew I had to try to recreate it. So that's what I'm going to be showing you today, was my recreation of this deck, making it up as I go and making it my own for my property in the mountains, my geodome. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, you know the drill. Screenshot this for all of the project materials that I used. You can do yours a little bit differently. This is just what I had. I had a ton of scrap boards left over from the Geodome deck build, so that's what I used for this Chevron pattern. To do this, I used deck blocks. It's a floating deck, so I started to lay those all out. I used 9 in total, and 2x10s were my beams. So I started to get this all laid out. My joists are 2x6s. And so the joist took a little bit of time to really think through the pattern and how that might lie, which is why the middle joist, I secured the direct center one, but the 2 on each side I did not secure, as I knew those were going to be moved around a little bit. So what I used to attach the joists to the beams were hurricane ties. I like to use the rafter ties. And then on the corners, you're going to use a traditional hurricane ties, since the rafter tie will not work as you don't have any material to attach it to. Now, I know I've already mentioned this, but I had a ton of scrap boards from my Geodome deck build. So that's what I was using to actually create this. But the chevron pattern itself ends up being about 12 inches from end to end. And so what I did is I would take a 36-inch board roughly, or less. Ideally it's about 36, just so you have a little bit of wiggle room. And I would use my speed square to draw an angle that was 45 degrees. When you do this, then you'll actually get a 45-degree angle, and it will fit something like this. So once you start to get your pattern down, it's just a matter of repetition. It takes a little bit of time to make all these cuts. If I were not off the grid, I would definitely be using a miter saw to do these cuts, as it would be so much easier. But I am building off the grid, so I have to use what's available to me with no power, which in this case is my battery-powered circular saw. And so what I did after a few cuts is I started to get smart, and I realized if you did a board, this is why I'm saying 36-inch board or a little bit less, between 30 and 36 inches, when you make one cut, you actually get 2 pieces. So you get to the full chevron pattern from just one singular cut. So once I realized that, I started to work smarter, not harder, and just started to do just one cut. It was so much easier to just do a straight cut instead of the angle cut, because obvious reasons, it's a little bit tricky on a circular saw. So once you have that, then I would cut. Here you can see I'm just taking a permanent marker. This is 15 inches from the longest point to the flat edge. 15 inches for each of those, and then basically that gave me the overall chevron pattern. Now here's the good news. Once you have this done, that you have your first set, then it's just a matter of tracing. So you can see that I've got all this. I got some funky boards, what do you do? But I would just take my existing template and just draw a line. Here I am just checking to make sure it's actually still 45 degrees. It is. So I just had to do a little double check before I cut a ton of boards that way. But once that's done, you just draw your line and you continue forward. Now, again, this is before I realized that it was smarter to do a longer board. But, here we are, just learning as we go, per usual, when it comes to any type of project. So this was really quite fun. It was kind of therapeutic. Once you really get into it, it's quite easy. It's not too bad. You just have to just continue that process of repetition. Once you have all of your pieces cut, I started to just lay them out on the joists in the center. And the hardest part was lining up that center line so that it wasn't crooked and it actually didn't hurt your eyes to look at. So that was about the most difficult part. The spacing was a little bit tricky as well. But again, everything is figure outable. It was not overly difficult, just a little bit time consuming to get this pattern correct. Once it's all laid out, then you get to the fun part. You have to take a chalk line and just do the best that you can. It's not going to be totally perfect. I mean, especially, there's probably ways to do it perfectly. I'm just new at this and just was making it up as I go. So I took a chalk line and drew, or snapped it, I should say, along the edge. So here I am just cutting along my chalk line, again, as patiently as I possibly can, trying to get this as best as possible to give me a flat edge. So then a 2x6 can be butted up against it flat to give it that patterned, almost picture frame look from the inspiration picture. And what I found is I actually messed up. I didn't cut it short enough. And so see how that one's perfectly straight. The other one is not. So I had to fix that. The board, the joist that's right next to it, is a little bit closer than you would think should be there. What I found is that you actually should have did 2 joists butted up against each other along the chevron part on the left, so that that picture frame part, the little flat 2x6, has even more security. So that is something I had to go back through and add in later, if that makes sense. And at this point, I was about halfway done. And the end of day 1, I had a 2-hour drive back home. So I was cutting it out at about here. Now, I left those last pieces because I knew they were going to be a little bit more complicated. And I would have to shave off also that last top board just a little bit so that it sits flush with the overall pattern. So again, this deck is a 7-foot by 10-foot deck. So the last pattern, the good thing is when you cut off those little edges along the chevron, you get a lot of square pieces. So while I thought these little end pieces here and on the other side of the chevron pattern were going to be really difficult, they're actually quite easy because I already had those pieces from the trim boards, which was so great from that chevron straight cut. So it worked out incredibly well and was a lot easier than I expected. Once you have this, I need to finish it with the trim boards on the edge, but this is what it looks like. What do you think? I personally love, love, love the way it turned out, and I think it looks really similar to the inspiration picture. Thank you so much for tuning in and following along as I build my geodome property. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed it.